Chapter 4, The Insider Part 2, The Crucible, 2015-2018. On the morning of Saturday, October 3, 2015, a high school football coach in suburban New Jersey opened the DraftKings app on his phone, deposited $200, and entered 4 NFL contests at a combined entry fee of $175. The coach's name does not appear in any regulatory filing or court document. He was not a professional daily fantasy player. He was a 41-year-old man who had played season-long fantasy football since his college years at Rutgers, who had downloaded DraftKings during the advertising blitz of September 2015, and who had, over the preceding 3 weeks, developed the habit of constructing his DFS rosters on Saturday mornings while his daughters ate cereal in the next room and his wife reviewed the weekend schedule on a whiteboard mounted to the kitchen wall. He built his rosters the way most recreational users built theirs, with a combination of knowledge, intuition, and the information available through the platform's player cards and publicly accessible statistical databases. The quarterbacks with favorable matchups were identifiable through the same injury reports the NFL published on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday of each week. He read the analysis columns on DraftKings' own editorial blog, which published player projections, salary cap advice, and ownership percentage estimates that its writers compiled through a blend of survey data and professional judgment. The ownership percentage estimates were the critical variable. In large field DFS tournaments, where thousands of users competed for a shared prize pool, the optimal strategy depended not only on selecting the highest performing players, but on selecting players whom other users had not selected. A player who scored 30 fantasy points was valuable. A player who scored 30 fantasy points while appearing on fewer than 5% of competing rosters was worth far more, because the scarcity of his selection amplified the scoring advantage across a field where most competitors did not benefit from his performance. The concept was called leverage, and it was the strategic mechanism that separated professionals from recreationals. The mathematics of leverage were precise. In a tournament of 10,000 entries, a player selected by 40% of the field appeared on 4,000 rosters. If that player scored well, 4,000 rosters benefited. The advantage was shared so widely that it provided minimal differentiation. A player selected by 3% of the field appeared on 300 rosters. If that player scored equally well, 300 rosters benefited while 9th and 700 did not. The 300 rosters that contained the low ownership player gained a scoring advantage over 97% of the field. The advantage was structural, mathematical, and available to anyone who could estimate ownership percentages with accuracy. Accuracy was the problem. The professionals devoted substantial resources to estimating ownership percentages before contests locked. They surveyed expert opinion, analyzed historical selection patterns, modeled the relationship between salary cap price and expected ownership, and combined multiple estimation methods into composite projections whose precision exceeded casual intuition by significant margins. The recreationals relied on the estimates published in editorial content, on personal judgment, and on the assumption that the information available to them was the same information available to everyone. The assumption was wrong. On the afternoon of Friday, October 2, 2015, a DraftKings content manager named Ethan Haskell was producing editorial material for the company's blog. The work was routine. Haskell's role involved compiling player analysis, statistical projections, and ownership percentage data into articles designed to help users construct competitive rosters for the upcoming NFL slate. The ownership percentage data he accessed was proprietary. It was derived from the actual rosters that DraftKings users had submitted for the weekend's contests. It showed with precision unavailable through any external source exactly which players were appearing on the highest percentage of submitted rosters and which players were appearing on the lowest. This data was the most valuable competitive intelligence in daily fantasy sports. A user who possessed precise ownership percentages before contest lock could construct rosters optimized for leverage with a degree of accuracy that no public estimate could match. The user could identify the exact players whose low ownership would maximize differential scoring. The user could avoid the exact players whose high ownership would minimize differential advantage, even in the event of strong performance. The data transformed roster construction from an exercise in projection to an exercise in precision. The difference between an estimated ownership percentage of around 15% and a known ownership percentage of 11.7% was the difference between a recreational guess and an institutional advantage. Haskell possessed this data as a function of his job. He accessed it to write blog posts. The blog posts he published contained sanitized analysis derived from the data, not the data itself. The raw ownership percentages were proprietary. They were not intended for public distribution. On Friday, October 2nd, Haskell made an error. During the production of a blog post, he accidentally included raw ownership percentage data in the published content. The data was live on the DraftKings website for approximately 18 minutes before the error was identified and the post was corrected. The 18-minute window was sufficient for the information to be captured by users who monitored DraftKings editorial content for competitive intelligence. The information was shared on DFS forums, analyzed by professional players, and archived by individuals who recognized its value. Haskell also maintained an active account on FanDuel, DraftKings' primary competitor. Account records produced during subsequent federal investigation documented that his FanDuel contest activity increased during the weekend of October 3 through 4th. His entry fees totaled several $1,000s across multiple tournaments. His lineup construction, analyzed by federal investigators and independent researchers after the fact, demonstrated a pattern consistent with contrarian strategies optimized for leverage. Player selections focused on low-ownership alternatives whose projected performance exceeded their salary cap cost relative to popular choices. The strategies incorporated correlation effects and variance management techniques typically associated with professional-grade analytical infrastructure. His results exceeded statistical expectations for recreational participants by a margin that attracted attention before any public connection to the data leak had been established. Professional DFS players who monitored unusual outcomes identified Haskell's performance during the weekend and posted analysis on forums questioning the information sources that could produce such specific and such consistently contrarian player selections. The online analysis was granular. It reverse-engineered his lineup construction and mapped the selections against the ownership percentage data that had been briefly published on the DraftKings blog 2 days earlier. The correlation was visible to anyone who looked. Banking records produced during the federal investigation documented total FanDuel winnings of approximately $350,000 across the October 3 to 4 weekend. The sum represented a substantial multiple of Haskell's annual salary as a DraftKings content manager. The New York Times published the story on October 5, 2015. The reporting connected the DraftKings data leak to Haskell's FanDuel contest performance and framed the incident in language that the industry had spent 3 years and nearly $1 billion in advertising trying to avoid: insider trading. The phrase was precise and devastating. In financial markets, insider trading occurs when a person trades securities based on material, non-public information. In daily fantasy sports, the equivalent occurred when a company employee used proprietary data about contest composition to construct rosters on a competing platform with an informational advantage unavailable to ordinary users. The legal frameworks governing the two activities were different. The economic logic was identical. A person with access to information that others did not possess used that information to generate profit at the expense of those who did not possess it. The Times reporting triggered a cascade that the industry's advertising budget was powerless to contain. The story was picked up by every major news outlet in the country. ESPN, which had entered a promotional partnership with DraftKings, covered the scandal on its programming, while its own network aired DraftKings advertisements during commercial breaks. The juxtaposition was visible to any viewer who paid attention. The editorial content questioned the integrity of daily fantasy sports, while the advertising content promised that daily fantasy sports was a fair game of skill. Congressional attention followed within days. Representative Frank Pallone Jr. of New Jersey, chairman of the House Energy and Commerce Subcommittee, delivered prepared remarks during a recorded committee session that included mathematical analysis of Haskell's success rates. The numbers, Poloni argued, exceeded statistical probability for recreational participants by margins that indicated access to information unavailable through legitimate means. His conclusion, rendered in the congressional record, was blunt. When employees can use inside information to win hundreds of thousands of dollars, we're not talking about fantasy sports. We're talking about a rigged casino. The word casino landed on the industry with the force of a verdict. The Federal Bureau of Investigation opened an inquiry. The investigation's scope extended beyond Haskell's individual conduct to encompass industry-wide practices regarding employee oversight, data security, and the structural relationship between company employees and the contest pools in which those employees' customers competed. FBI agents interviewed DraftKings and FanDuel employees. They reviewed internal communications, data access logs, and training materials. They assessed whether the companies had maintained security protocols adequate to prevent the misuse of proprietary data by employees with access to information that could influence contest outcomes. The assessment was not favorable. Federal investigation records documented that neither DraftKings nor FanDuel had implemented training programs addressing the handling of proprietary contest data or the potential legal exposure associated with employee access to competitive intelligence. The companies had maintained what investigators characterized as casual policies regarding employee participation on competing platforms. Employees of both companies routinely played DFS contests on the rival's platform. The practice was not prohibited. It was not monitored. It was not subject to disclosure requirements or compliance review. The casual approach reflected the startup culture from which both companies had emerged. In the spare bedroom in Watertown, in the early office in Boston, the distinction between employee and user had been meaningless. The founders played their own product. The first engineers played their own product. The company's internal culture treated DFS participation as a demonstration of engagement, not a conflict of interest. As the companies grew, as the contest pools expanded into the millions of dollars, as the proprietary data accumulated in databases accessible to dozens and then hundreds of employees, the casual policies persisted. The policies that were harmless when 3 founders played contests in a spare bedroom became hazardous when hundreds of employees had access to ownership percentage data in a company processing millions of dollars in daily contest entries. The hazard had materialized. The industry's response was reactive. Class action lawsuits were filed in multiple jurisdictions within weeks of the Times reporting. The plaintiffs alleged that both DraftKings and FanDuel had engaged in false advertising by promoting daily fantasy as recreational entertainment accessible to casual sports fans, while possessing internal data demonstrating that market dynamics concentrated winnings among a small percentage of professional-grade participants. The complaints cited marketing materials that featured amateur winners holding oversized checks alongside internal analytics showing that the vast majority of participants lost money over any extended period of play. The gap between what the advertisements promised and what the data showed was, in the plaintiff's legal theory, a violation of consumer protection statutes in every state where the companies operated. The litigation exposed a second category of internal documentation, records showing that both companies possessed behavioral data capable of identifying users whose engagement patterns indicated escalating losses. The data existed. The companies used it to optimize promotional targeting and retention campaigns. They did not use it to identify users who might benefit from responsible gaming interventions. The distinction between using behavioral data to retain users and using behavioral data to protect users would become a central question in the regulatory proceedings that followed. On the morning of October 6th, the day after the Times story published, both DraftKings and FanDuel issued parallel announcements prohibiting employees from participating in daily fantasy contests on any platform. The prohibitions took effect that day. The prohibitions were framed as precautionary measures, not admissions of wrongdoing. The companies retained independent investigators to review internal data access policies and employee conduct. The investigations were described in press releases carefully drafted by corporate communications teams operating in crisis mode as evidence of the company's commitment to integrity and transparency. The language of the response was instructive. DraftKings' public statement emphasized that no evidence had been found to indicate that Haskell had used proprietary data to gain an advantage in the specific contests where he had won $350,000. The statement was technically defensible. The federal investigation had not yet reached a conclusion. The evidence was circumstantial: the data leak, the timing, the performance, the correlation. Circumstantial evidence was not proof. The company's legal position was that the temporal proximity of the data leak and the contest winnings did not establish a causal relationship. The public did not parse the distinction. The public heard, DraftKings employee wins $350,000 using data his company possessed and ordinary users did not. The public processed the headline through the same frame it used for financial scandals. The House had cheated. The game was rigged. The promises of fairness that had saturated every commercial break of every NFL broadcast for the past month were, at best, incomplete, and at worst, false. Jason Robbins addressed the crisis in a series of media appearances during the first week of October. His statements were consistent, measured, and structured around two claims. First, that the Haskell incident was an isolated failure of individual judgment, not a systemic practice. And second, that DraftKings was committed to implementing enhanced data security protocols that would prevent similar incidents in the future. The claims were defensible. The incident may have been isolated. The protocols were, in fact, implemented. But the claims addressed the specific allegation without addressing the structural vulnerability that the allegation had exposed. The structural vulnerability was information asymmetry, not the specific asymmetry of the Haskell incident, where one employee possessed data that other users did not. The broader asymmetry that defined the relationship between the platform and its users. DraftKings possessed aggregate data about contest composition, user behavior, deposit patterns, and lineup construction that no individual user could access. The company used this data to optimize its product, calibrate its promotional offers, and manage its contest economics. The data was a corporate asset. Its existence was a structural feature of any platform that hosted contests among thousands of users. The question the Haskell scandal forced into public view was not whether a single employee had misused data. The question was whether a platform that possessed asymmetric information about the contests it hosted and the users who paid to enter them could credibly claim that those contests were fair. The question had no comfortable answer. The high school football coach in New Jersey lost $175 on October 3 to 4, 2015. The sum was not catastrophic. It was not life-altering. It was the cost of 4 DFS contests, entered on a Saturday morning while his daughters ate cereal, settled by Sunday evening after the late afternoon NFL games concluded. The loss was within his recreational budget, if barely. He did not contact DraftKings to complain. He did not file a regulatory complaint. He did not join the class action lawsuits that were filed in multiple jurisdictions in the weeks following the scandal. He deposited another $50 the following Tuesday and entered 2 contests for the next NFL slate. He was not a victim of the Haskell incident in any specific, provable sense. His contest entries may or may not have competed against rosters constructed with the benefit of proprietary ownership data. The contests he entered on October 3rd to 4th were hosted on DraftKings, not FanDuel, and Haskell's documented winnings occurred on FanDuel. The overlap between the leaked data and the specific contests the coach entered was, in all likelihood, 0. He was a victim of something else. He was a victim of the asymmetry. Not the Haskell asymmetry, the specific and remediable failure of one employee's judgment, the permanent asymmetry, the structural condition in which a recreational user entered a contest against a field that included professional-grade participants whose analytical infrastructure exceeded his own by orders of magnitude. The 1.3% asymmetry, the figure that federal investigators would document in their review of industry practices. In the first half of 2015, approximately 1.3% of DFS users had won 91% of all prize money across both DraftKings and FanDuel. The statistic was not produced by the Haskell scandal. It was produced by the structure of the game. DFS contests pooled recreational users and professional users in the same fields, charged both the same entry fees, and distributed prizes from a shared pool. The professionals entered hundreds of contests per day using lineup optimization software that generated thousands of roster permutations, evaluated each permutation against statistical models trained on historical performance data, and selected the combinations most likely to produce top percentile outcomes in large field tournaments. The professionals treated DFS as a full-time occupation. Their analytical infrastructure included proprietary models, subscription data services, and collaboration networks that shared research and optimized strategies across pools of professional capital. The recreational user, the football coach entering 4 contests on a Saturday morning, competed against this infrastructure with a phone, a player card, and the estimates published on a blog. The contest rules did not distinguish between the two. The entry fees were the same. The prize pool was shared. The professionals' lineup and the coaches' lineup occupied the same field, and the professionals' lineup was constructed with tools, data, and analytical precision that the coach did not possess, could not afford, and in many cases did not know existed. The platform's rules permitted this arrangement. DraftKings did not restrict the number of contests a single user could enter. It did not restrict the use of third-party optimization software. It did not segregate recreational users from professionals. It did not disclose to users entering a contest what percentage of that contest's field consisted of multi-entry professionals whose analytical infrastructure gave them structural advantages over single-entry recreational participants. A football coach entering a $25 NFL tournament on a Saturday morning had no way to determine, from the information displayed in the contest lobby, whether he was competing against 50 casual players or 500 optimized lineups submitted by 12 professional accounts. The information to answer that question existed. It existed in the same database that contained the ownership percentages Haskell had accidentally published. The platform possessed the data. The platform chose not to share it. The Haskell scandal did not destroy the daily fantasy sports industry. It did something more corrosive. It introduced doubt. Before October 5, 2015, the narrative surrounding DFS was controlled by the companies that operated it. The narrative was one of skill, fairness, and entertainment. The advertisements featured winners. The promotional copy promised a level playing field. The legal argument was that DFS was a game of skill, and skill implied fairness, and fairness implied that the outcome depended on the participants' effort and knowledge, not on asymmetric access to information or structural advantages invisible to casual users. After October 5th, the narrative was shared. The companies still told their story, but the New York Times told a different one. The congressional hearings told a different one. The FBI investigation told a different one. The 1.3% statistic told the most devastating story of all, that the game was, for the vast majority of participants, a wealth transfer mechanism that moved money from recreational users to professional users while the platform collected its rake from both. The cultural moment was visible in the media's treatment of its own DFS partnerships. ESPN, which had signed a multi-year promotional agreement with DraftKings worth a reported $250 million, found itself covering the Haskell scandal on its news programming while airing DraftKings advertisements during commercial breaks on the same network. The editorial division reported the story with the rigor the story demanded. The business division honored the advertising contract with the obligation the contract required. The two operations coexisted on the same broadcast signal, separated by the 3-second fade to commercial. A viewer who paid attention could watch an ESPN anchor question the integrity of daily fantasy sports, see a DraftKings advertisement promising $1 million in prizes this Sunday, and return to the anchor's coverage of the regulatory fallout, all within a single commercial break cycle. ESPN did not terminate its DraftKings partnership in October 2015. The partnership was too valuable. The scandal was too significant. Both facts persisted. The doubt was productive. It forced questions that the industry's advertising budget had successfully deferred for 3 years. If DFS was a game of skill, whose skill was being measured? If the field included professionals with access to optimization software, subscription data services, and collaborative research networks, was the skill being measured the recreational user's knowledge of football, or the professional's ability to deploy computational resources at scale? If 1.3% of users won 91% of the money, was the product recreational entertainment, or was it a market in which a small number of informed participants extracted value from a large number of uninformed participants? A market whose economic structure was, in every functional respect, identical to the financial markets whose analogies the industry had spent 3 years denying. The questions were not editorial, they were structural. They emerged from the data the industry itself had generated. The 1.3% figure was not produced by a hostile regulator or an anti-gambling advocate. It was produced by the contest results that the platforms had processed and stored. The data was the argument. The argument did not require an adjective. The industry's defenders responded with counter-arguments that were, in isolation, defensible. Skill mattered. The law said so. The UAGA exempted fantasy sports. The contests were fair in the sense that every user had access to the same publicly available statistical information. The presence of professionals did not invalidate the contest any more than the presence of professional poker players invalidated a poker tournament open to amateurs. The counter-arguments did not address the doubt, they addressed the accusation. The accusation was that DFS was rigged. The counter-argument was that DFS was legal. The two claims occupied different planes. The industry could be legal and still be unfair. The contests could satisfy the UIGA's definition of skill and still concentrate winnings among a fraction of participants whose advantages were invisible to the majority. The law and the ethics were not the same question. The doubt persisted. It followed the industry through the fall of 2015 and into the winter, where it would meet a second crisis that made the Haskell scandal look like a prelude. In November, the Attorney General of New York would issue a cease and desist letter asserting that DraftKings contests were not games of skill at all. They were, in the Attorney General's legal judgment, illegal gambling. The letter would initiate a regulatory confrontation that would shut down paid DFS operations in the state of New York and trigger a nationwide re-examination of the legal distinction on which the entire industry rested. The crack in the foundation that had formed with the Haskell scandal was about to widen. The high school football coach in New Jersey continued playing through October. He deposited $200 on October 10th and entered 6 contests. He deposited $150 on October 17th and entered 4. His cumulative deposits since creating his account in September totaled $1,140. His cumulative withdrawals totaled $220. His net loss was $1,520 distributed across 63 contests over 6 weeks, an average loss of $24.13 per contest entry. He had read the New York Times article about Haskell. He had watched the ESPN segments about the insider trading allegations. He had seen Representative Pallone's statement on the evening news. He processed the information the way most recreational users processed it, as a scandal involving a specific individual, not as evidence of a structural condition. The specific individual had been punished. The companies had implemented new policies. The problem had been addressed. He entered his contests the following Saturday. The platform did not inform him that his cumulative loss of $1,520 placed him in a cohort whose spending exceeded the recreational average by a factor of 4. The platform's responsible gaming tools were available in the account settings. He had not activated them. The platform did not prompt him to activate them. The platform's interface surfaced the contest lobby, the salary cap builder, and the deposit screen. It did not surface the transaction history that would have shown him in a single table that he had deposited $1,740 and withdrawn $220, and that the difference between those numbers was growing with each passing week. He was not unique. He was a cluster. He was a segment. He was a data point in a database that contained millions of records. And his pattern, replicated across thousands of users in hundreds of cities, was the pattern that funded the prize pools, the platform's rake, the advertising blitz, and the venture capital returns. The system did not know his name. It knew his classification. It knew his deposit frequency, his session timing, his contest preferences, his response rate to promotional offers. It knew that he responded to bonus credit emails at a rate 23% higher than the segment average. It knew that his deposits increased on Saturdays between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m. during the window when the system had inferred from behavioral patterns it could not explain but could predict he was at home with time to play. The system had learned his rhythm. The system used his rhythm to send him offers calibrated to arrive during the window when his probability of depositing was highest. The offers were not targeted at him as an individual. They were targeted at his segment. But the segment's behavioral profile was specific enough that the targeting functioned in practice as a personalized intervention delivered to a man whose cumulative losses were growing and whose deposits were increasing in response to promotional offers timed to the hour of his maximum receptivity. The coach did not know this. The coach entered his contests on Saturday mornings while his daughters ate cereal and his wife reviewed the weekend schedule. The coach believed he was playing a game of skill. He was. Skill mattered. His skill was insufficient to overcome the structural advantages of the professional participants who occupied the same contest fields, and his skill was insufficient to overcome the mathematical certainty that over an extended period of play, the platform's 10% rake would erode his balance with the quiet inevitability of interest compounding in the wrong direction. The advertisements had told him he could win big. The advertisements were not false. Users did win big. The 1.3% won big. The coach was not in the 1.3%. The coach was in the 98.7%, and the 98.7% funded the prizes, the rake, and the machine. The machine processed his deposits without judgment. The machine classified his behavior without interpretation. The machine predicted his next deposit with a probability it updated after each session. The machine did not know that he was a high school football coach in New Jersey who loved the sport the way he had loved it since Rutgers, who had played fantasy football for 20 years, and who had been converted by $1 billion in advertising and a push notification timed to his Saturday morning from a fan into a revenue source. The machine did not know that in November, Karen would open the joint checking account statement and count the DK charges. She would count them twice. The total, across 9 weeks, would be $1,740 in deposits against $220 in withdrawals, and the difference between those numbers would produce a conversation at the kitchen table after the girls were in bed that the platform's responsible gaming tools were designed to prevent, but that the platform's interface was designed to defer. The conversation would be quiet, the conversation would be specific, the conversation would involve the soccer registration due in January, the property tax payment due in December, and the $1,520 that was no longer available for either. The platform would not be present for the conversation. The platform would not be informed of the conversation. The platform's systems would register only that the coach's deposit frequency declined in the second week of November, that his account transitioned from the high-frequency cohort to the at-risk cohort, and that the re-engagement promotional offer sent on November 14th at 8:17 a.m., a $25 bonus credit timed to his Saturday morning window, was not opened. The system would classify his non-response. The system would update its probability models. The system would route its promotional budget to the next user in the segment whose deposit probability exceeded the threshold. The machine knew his number. The number was sufficient. Chapter 5. The Attorney General. Part 2. The Crucible. 2015-2018. The cease and desist letter arrived at DraftKings' Boston headquarters on November 10, 2015, in an envelope bearing the seal of the State of New York, Office of the Attorney General. The letter was 4 pages long. It addressed Jason Robbins by name. It informed him that the Attorney General's office had determined that DraftKings paid daily fantasy sports contests constituted illegal gambling under New York state law, ordering the company to cease accepting wagers from New York residents immediately, and warning that failure to comply would result in an enforcement action seeking injunctive relief, civil penalties, and disgorgement of profits derived from New York customers. Eric T. Schneiderman signed the letter. Schneiderman was 51 years old, a graduate of Harvard Law School, a former state senator representing the Upper West Side, and in November 2015, the most powerful law enforcement official in the state that generated approximately 12% of DraftKings' total revenue. He had been elected Attorney General in 2010 on a platform that emphasized consumer protection and financial regulation. His office had pursued cases against Bank of America, Barclays, and J.P. Morgan Chase. He had sued the Trump Organization over its for-profit university. His prosecutorial record suggested a preference for targets whose public profiles guaranteed media coverage and whose business practices provided factual foundations for the moral narratives his press conferences required. DraftKings met both criteria. The timing of the letter was not coincidental. 5 weeks had elapsed since the Haskell insider trading story broke in the New York Times. 5 weeks during which congressional hearings had aired the 1.3% statistic on cable news. 5 weeks during which the phrase rigged casino had migrated from editorial commentary to congressional testimony to the linguistic common ground of millions of Americans who had never played a DFS contest but who now possessed an opinion about the industry's legitimacy. Schneiderman's office had been investigating DFS operators since September. The Haskell scandal had not initiated the investigation, it had accelerated it. The political conditions for enforcement had shifted from favorable to irresistible. The legal theory underlying the cease and desist was straightforward. New York Penal Law Section 225.0 defined gambling as staking or risking something of value upon the outcome of a contest of chance or a future contingent event not under the person's control or influence. The statute's definition of contest of chance included any contest in which chance is a material element. The Attorney General's position was that daily fantasy sports contests, despite the skill involved in roster construction, contained material elements of chance, player injuries, weather conditions, referee decisions, the unpredictable variance inherent in any single sporting event, and therefore fell within the statutory definition. The argument was not novel. It was the same argument that anti-gambling advocates had advanced since DFS operators first invoked the UIGA fantasy sports exemption. What was novel was the authority behind it. An editorial column could argue that DFS was gambling. A state attorney general could shut it down. Robbins received the letter at 10:14 a.m. By 10:47 a.m., according to internal communication logs later produced during litigation, he had convened a crisis call with DraftKings general counsel, outside litigation counsel at Gibson Dunn, and the company's government affairs team, which at that point consisted of 2 people. The company that had spent $206 million on advertising in 2015 had allocated the salary equivalent of 2 mid-level employees to managing its relationship with the governments that regulated its right to operate. The disproportion was instructive. DraftKings had been built by men who had mastered customer acquisition funnels, lifetime value calculations, and conversion optimization. They had not been built to navigate the machinery of state government. The advertising budget reflected what the founders valued. The government affairs budget reflected what they had failed to anticipate, that a company operating in the regulatory gray zone between game of skill and gambling would eventually be required to defend that classification against an adversary whose weapons were subpoenas, injunctions, and the criminal code. The crisis call lasted 2 hours and 14 minutes. The legal analysis produced during that call, later disclosed in investor litigation, identified 3 immediate threats. First, the New York market. The state represented over $40 million in annual gross revenue, and its loss would create a hole in financial projections that could not be filled by organic growth in other states within the timeline required to maintain investor confidence. Second, the precedent. If New York successfully classified DFS as illegal gambling, other state attorneys general would follow, and the domino effect could dismantle the company's legal foundation nationwide. Third, the signal. The cease and desist told the market, investors, partners, professional sports leagues with equity stakes, that the regulatory risk they had been assured was manageable was, in fact, existential. The signal reached the market before DraftKings issued a public response. By noon on November 10th, DraftKings' primary venture investors had initiated calls to the company's board. The conversations, referenced in board minutes later produced during SEC review of the SPAC transaction, centered on a single question. Was the legal exposure limited to New York, or was it systemic? The honest answer was that nobody knew. Schneiderman held a press conference on the afternoon of November 10th. The setting was the Attorney General's press room in Lower Manhattan, a space designed with the architectural vocabulary of prosecutorial authority. An elevated podium, the state seal mounted on the wall behind the speaker, lighting arranged to cast the Attorney General in sharp relief against a background of institutional gravity. Schneiderman spoke for 11 minutes. He referenced the Haskell insider trading scandal. He cited the 1.3% statistic. He described DFS operators as companies that had turned fantasy sports into a large-scale, unlicensed gambling operation, and that had used massive marketing campaigns to persuade New Yorkers to participate in contests that are neither combats of skill nor combats of chance. They are simply illegal gambling. Schneiderman had calculated the phrase simply illegal gambling to collapse the legal ambiguity that DFS operators had cultivated for 3 years into a 4-word verdict. The UEGA exemption, the skill versus chance arguments, the regulatory gray zone, Schneiderman's language erased the complexity and replaced it with a prosecutorial conclusion delivered with the confidence of a man who controlled the enforcement apparatus of the nation's 4th largest state. The response inside DraftKings headquarters was immediate and, according to employees present during the period, visceral. The company's open plan office in Boston's financial district served as startup in growth mode. Standing desks, collaborative spaces, screens displaying real-time user metrics and revenue dashboards. The dashboards now displayed the Attorney General's press conference on one monitor and the company's real-time deposit flow on another. The deposit flow from New York IP addresses began declining within hours of the press conference. Users who had seen the coverage were withdrawing funds. Users who had not yet seen the coverage continued depositing. The two populations coexisted on the same platform, separated by the speed at which information traveled from a podium in Lower Manhattan to a phone screen in Buffalo. Illinois followed New York within 48 hours. Attorney General Lisa Madigan issued a statement characterizing DFS as gambling under Illinois law and warning operators that continued operation could result in prosecution. Nevada's Gaming Control Board, which had already determined in October that DFS operators required state gaming licenses, formalized its position with a cease and desist of its own. Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton issued an advisory opinion classifying DFS as illegal gambling under state law. 4 states in 10 days. The pattern was not coordinated in the formal sense. No multi-state task force had been convened, no joint investigation was underway. The pattern was mimetic. Schneiderman had provided a template. The legal theory was transferable. The political incentive was universal. Attorneys general are elected officials, and consumer protection cases against companies that preyed on ordinary people generated favorable media coverage in any state, in any news cycle, under any set of political conditions. The Haskell scandal had made DFS a story that voters recognized. The cease and desist letters transformed that recognition into regulatory action. Each attorney general who acted made the next action easier because each action added to the emerging consensus that DFS was gambling and that the operators had known it. DraftKings filed its legal response in New York State Supreme Court on November 13th, 3 days after the cease and desist. The company sought a temporary restraining order preventing the Attorney General from enforcing the cease and desist, arguing that DFS was protected by the UEGA's explicit fantasy sports exemption and that New York's enforcement action was preempted by federal law. The legal theory was aggressive. It asserted that Congress, in carving out the fantasy sports exemption, had created a federal authorization that no state could override through its own gambling statutes. The argument had surface appeal. Congress had indeed exempted fantasy sports from the UEGA, but the exemption was narrower than DraftKings' legal filing suggested. The UEGIA exempted fantasy sports from the federal prohibition on processing payments for illegal online gambling. It did not create an affirmative federal right to operate fantasy sports in states that classified such operations as gambling under their own laws. The distinction between not federally prohibited and federally authorized was the gap through which Schneiderman's entire enforcement theory fit. Justice Manuel Mendez of the New York State Supreme Court heard the application for a temporary restraining order on November 16th. The hearing lasted 3 hours. Justice Mendez denied the restraining order. His ruling was procedural rather than substantive. He found that DraftKings had not demonstrated the irreparable harm required for emergency injunctive relief. But the practical effect was immediate. DraftKings was required to cease operations in New York pending the outcome of the full litigation. The New York shutdown removed approximately 360,000 active users from the platform overnight. The financial impact was quantifiable, the strategic impact was not. DraftKings' growth model depended on network effects. More users generated larger prize pools attracted more users, and the cycle sustained itself through the mathematical reinforcement of participation. Removing New York did not simply reduce revenue by 12%. It reduced the prize pools that attracted users in every other state. It reduced the tournament fields that made large field contests viable. It reduced the promotional offers that the marketing team could fund with New York's contribution to gross revenue. The damage propagated through the network the way a removed load-bearing wall propagates through a building. The visible failure was local, but the structural stress was distributed. Inside the company, the crisis forced a transformation that the founders had resisted since DraftKings' first day of operation. The company needed a political operation, not a government affairs team, not 2 employees monitoring regulatory developments and filing comments on proposed legislation. A political operation, lobbyists, former legislators, political consultants, campaign strategists, coalition builders, and the institutional infrastructure required to wage a sustained campaign across 50 state capitals simultaneously. The company needed to become, in addition to a technology platform and a marketing machine, a political actor. The transformation began in December 2015. DraftKings hired James Chisholm, a former Massachusetts state legislator, as its first senior director of government affairs. Within weeks, Chisholm had retained lobbying firms in 12 states, where DFS legislation was pending or anticipated. The selection criteria for the firms reflected the political education that the crisis had accelerated. The companies hired were not the largest or the most prestigious, but the most connected, the firms whose partners had personal relationships with the committee chairs and majority leaders who controlled which bills reached the floor. The lobbying operation grew faster than any other division in the company's history. By March 2016, DraftKings had retained lobbying firms or individual lobbyists in 31 states. The monthly expenditure on government affairs exceeded $2 million, a figure that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier, when the entire government affairs budget for the year had been projected at $800,000. The lobbying disclosures filed with state ethics commissions during this period documented a spending trajectory that resembled the customer acquisition curves the company's marketing team had once celebrated: exponential growth driven by competitive necessity and funded by capital that had been allocated for purposes the investors had not anticipated when they wrote the checks. The lobbying strategy was built on a single legislative objective: the creation of a new legal category. DraftKings did not attempt to argue that DFS was not gambling. The company had spent 3 years making that argument in marketing materials, investor presentations, and public statements, and the argument had failed in the arena that mattered. Schneiderman had rejected it. 4 state attorneys general had rejected it. The courts had declined to intervene on DraftKings' behalf. The game of skill narrative, which had been sufficient to attract venture capital and sports league partnerships, was insufficient to survive prosecutorial scrutiny. The new strategy was different. Instead of defending the existing classification, DraftKings would create a new one. The company's lobbyists drafted model legislation that defined interactive fantasy sports as a distinct legal category. Not gambling, not a game of chance, not a lottery, but a new thing, a product category that had not existed in any state's statutory code before 2016, and that would be governed by its own regulatory framework, separate from the gambling statutes that attorneys general had invoked. The legislative language was precise in its evasions. The model bill defined interactive fantasy sports as contests in which participants assembled rosters of real athletes. The outcomes were determined by the statistical performance of those athletes in real sporting events, and the entry fees and prizes were established in advance. The definition was broad enough to encompass every DFS contest DraftKings offered, and narrow enough to exclude slot machines, roulette wheels, and the other products of traditional gambling that legislators would not agree to reclassify. The bill required operators to register with a designated state agency, pay licensing fees, implement responsible gaming tools, and submit to periodic audits. The regulatory apparatus was real. The compliance obligations were genuine. The licensing fees generated revenue for the state. The strategy was regulatory arbitrage executed through the legislative process. The same economic activity that Schneiderman had classified as illegal gambling would be reclassified, through the passage of new legislation, as legal interactive fantasy sports. The users would deposit the same money, they would enter the same contests, they would win or lose based on the same combination of skill and chance. The platform would collect the same rake. The only thing that would change was the label, and the label was the difference between a criminal enterprise and a licensed operator. The legislative campaign proceeded state by state. The arguments DraftKings lobbyists presented to legislators were economic, not legal. Jobs, tax revenue, technology innovation. The lobbyists did not relitigate the skill versus chance debate in committee hearing rooms. They talked about the DraftKings employees who lived in the legislators' districts. They talked about the tax revenue that DFS licensing fees would generate. They talked about the innovation economy, the technology sector, the competitive disadvantage that states without DFS legislation would suffer as the industry consolidated in jurisdictions that had chosen regulation over prohibition. The economic arguments were effective because they were true. DraftKings did employ people. DFS licensing fees did generate revenue. The technology sector did prefer regulatory clarity to regulatory ambiguity. The arguments were also incomplete because they addressed the question legislators wanted to answer: how do I vote on this bill? Rather than the question the attorneys general had raised: is this gambling? Professional sports leagues provided critical support. The MLB, NBA, and NHL had equity stakes in DFS operators. Their lobbyists, whose relationships with state legislators predated the DFS industry by decades, reinforced the economic arguments with the credibility of institutions that voters trusted. A state legislator who was uncertain about DraftKings' lobbyist could be persuaded by Major League Baseball's lobbyist, because Major League Baseball was not a startup in a spare bedroom. It was the national pastime, and its endorsement of DFS carried institutional weight that no amount of DraftKings' lobbying budget could replicate. The New York legislative battle was the decisive engagement. The state whose attorney general had initiated the crisis would determine whether the legislative strategy could succeed in hostile territory. DraftKings and FanDuel combined their lobbying efforts in Albany, retaining a coalition of firms whose collective relationships spanned both chambers, both parties, and the governor's office. The combined lobbying expenditure in New York alone exceeded $3 million during the first half of 2016. The legislative debate in Albany lasted 5 months. The bill's sponsors framed it as consumer protection. Regulation was better than prohibition, because prohibition drove the activity underground, while regulation imposed oversight, transparency, and responsible gaming requirements. The bill's opponents, led by the state's casino industry and anti-gambling advocacy organizations, framed it as legalization of gambling through legislative reclassification. Both characterizations were accurate. The bill regulated an activity that the Attorney General had classified as illegal gambling by reclassifying it as something other than gambling, and then regulating the reclassified activity. The New York State Assembly passed the bill on June 19, 2016, by a vote of 91 to 47. The Senate followed. Governor Andrew Cuomo signed it into law. The law created the legal category of interactive fantasy sports in the New York Statutory Code. It required operators to pay licensing fees, implement deposit limits and self-exclusion tools, restrict advertising content, and submit to oversight by the New York State Gaming Commission. It authorized the same contests that Eric Schneiderman had classified as illegal gambling 5 months earlier. It authorized them under a different name. The settlement of the pending litigation between DraftKings and the Attorney General's office followed the legislation's passage. DraftKings paid $12 million, $6 million in penalties, and $6 million in consumer restitution, and agreed to enhanced compliance measures including independent auditing, advertising restrictions, and the implementation of responsible gaming tools that the company's own lobbyists had included in the model legislation they had drafted. The $12 million settlement represented approximately 6 days of DraftKings' 2015 advertising expenditure. The lobbying campaign that secured the legislation authorizing the company's continued operation in New York had cost approximately $3 million. The combined cost of the legal crisis, settlement, lobbying, legal fees, lost revenue during the shutdown period, and the government affairs infrastructure built to prevent future crises totaled, according to financial disclosures in the company's subsequent SPAC filing, approximately $32 million. The company had purchased for $32 million the right to continue doing what it had been doing before Schneiderman's letter arrived: the same contests, the same users, the same deposits, the same rake. The product had not changed. The law had changed around it. By the end of 2016, 17 states had passed legislation explicitly legalizing and regulating daily fantasy sports under frameworks modeled on the legislation DraftKings lobbyists had drafted. 12 additional states had introduced similar bills that were pending committee action. The legislative campaign had not merely survived the regulatory crisis. It had converted the crisis into a nationwide regulatory framework more favorable than anything the company had possessed before Schneiderman's letter arrived. Before November 2015, DraftKings had operated in a gray zone, technically legal under the UIG exemption, but vulnerable to the argument that state gambling laws applied regardless. After the legislative campaign, DraftKings operated under explicit state authorization in a growing number of jurisdictions, with licensing requirements that functioned as barriers to entry for potential competitors who lacked the capital to fund their own 31-state lobbying operations. The regulatory crisis had cost $32 million. The regulatory framework it produced was worth considerably more. The high school football coach in New Jersey, whose state passed its own DFS legislation in September 2016, did not follow the legislative process. He did not read the lobbying disclosures. He did not know that the contest he entered on a Saturday morning in October 2016 was authorized by a law that had been drafted by lobbyists retained by the company whose platform hosted the contest. The app worked. The contests were available. His deposits were accepted. The legal category under which his participation was authorized: interactive fantasy sports, a phrase that had not existed in any American statute 12 months earlier, was invisible to him. It was invisible to most users. It was visible to the lawyers, the lobbyists, the legislators, and the company whose continued operation depended on the distinction between a word and a thing. The word had changed. The thing had not. The company had learned a lesson that would define the next decade of its existence. When the law threatens your business, do not change your business. Change the law.